third session of this virtual conference put together by Macroeconomic Policy and Financing Division of UNSCAP. This is the third session focusing on macroeconomic policy responses, uh, fiscal space, and debt vulnerability. We have already seen the economic outlook of the region, and the world economy at large is facing a lot of challenges these days because of this pandemic. And Asia Pacific economies, in particular, which were growth locomotives, they had become very dynamic economies and were growth locomotive of the world economy, are facing a lot of unprecedented challenges in this year. So, what can be done in terms of macroeconomic policy responses? What is being done and what can be done, and how it is constrained by the fiscal space because revenues are going down, also because of the growth outlook going down. And some countries in this region are also facing elevated levels of debt vulnerability. So this session is going to be very interesting from the perspective of policy making. And so we have put together a very nice set of commentators and analysts from around the region and the world. So the session is divided into two parts. The first part will have three presentations, and the second one will have five panelists. So without any further ado, and because our program is quite packed, I would go straight to our presenters. And the first one is Holger Van Eden. He is with the International Monetary Fund. He is actually advisor, regional public financial management advisor to IMF for Southeast Asia, based in Bangkok. And he would have the first slot of presentation. So over to you, Holger. We can't hear you. You are muted, Holger. You are muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Sweta and UNSCAP. It's a pleasure to speak about fiscal response and prospects in Asia and the world. I'll try to keep it brief so that we can have more time for discussion. I've got a short presentation, basically based on the World Economic Output, the World Economic Outlook from October, and the Fiscal Monitor, a product of my home department in Washington, Fiscal Affairs Department. So let's start with the overview of the World Economic Outlook. I understand this morning there was already discussion on that, but deep recession in 2020, followed by a strong but partial and uneven recovery in 2021. Persistent effects on potential output as the downturn damages supply potential. So we're not going to, this crisis is really going to have a long drawn out impact also on poverty levels and so on. The risks are, of course, a resurgence in the pandemic and issues of getting the vaccine out, tightening of financial conditions, worrying because already before this crisis, debt levels were at historic highs and have increased even further, and further geopolitical issues and social unrest related in part to the COVID crisis. But trade tensions were already there before the crisis and will probably be exacerbated by the present circumstances. The policy package, of course, depends very much from country to country, and we'll go into more details on the fiscal policy package. but international coordination in these times is very important for the global funding of the vaccine, for healthcare spending, but especially for support for vulnerable countries. Over half of the low-income countries are in debt stress mode at the moment. We've provided 82 countries with emergency financing in this crisis. So there's a lot of international coordination that's necessary for providing countries the necessary financing. Income support in many advanced economies is necessary, and also in other countries. Ensuring the soundness of the financial system, is a crucial element of any policy agenda. And further, making use of the crisis, perhaps changing the focus of the going forward of economic policy to be more inclusive, green, and resilient. And perhaps we can discuss further what resilience means in the fiscal sphere. To start with a slightly positive news, the G2 GDP figures were slightly on the positive side, especially in countries such as the US and China. There were a number of countries that had a negative surprise, and those were surprisingly in Asia, where countries like India and the Philippines and Malaysia had stronger than expected downturns. For 2021, we do expect a strong recovery above historic growth levels, but 2020 is a very dire year for many countries, with in Asia perhaps more lower growth than seen before historically in the last 50 years, and especially countries dependent on tourism and exports were severely hit in Asia. Now, if we see the fiscal and monetary support for the crisis has been unprecedented. The total global fiscal response was about 12 trillion US dollars, or 12% of GDP. On the fiscal side, about half of which was budget support, and the other half was what we call below the line support in the form of credit guarantees, equity injections, and so on. And the fiscal support has been strongly supported also, of course, by the monetary side. Interest rates were lowered, but I think on the monetary side, the liquidity support and asset purchases were even more important. An important part of the fiscal support to understand is that advanced economies have been able to be much more aggressive in their fiscal packages than emerging countries and low-income countries. The size of the stimulus in emerging countries was about 4% of GDP, and liquidity was only 2% of GDP, and the size of the stimulus in low-income countries was even lower, and we'll come a bit further down on that. We see here for Asia also that the picture that the fiscal measures in the advanced economies were very high, especially in Japan. Total packages in advanced economy Asia was up to 25% of GDP, and in emerging Asia, due to financing constraints, those packages were considerably lower. Asian emerging market countries also saw considerable decreases of lowering of interest rates, and also for the first time in a global financial crisis, use of asset purchases by some of emerging market banks. So that was new in this crisis. Given the global environment of low income rates, monetary policy could do more in this crisis for emerging market countries than before. Debt vulnerabilities are on the rise in Asia. Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Mongolia are to some extent the worst performers, but overall for Asian advanced economies, for emerging market economies and low-income countries, ratios are on the rise, and we see that the number of credit rating, negative credit rating or downturns of credit ratings have increased, and also the outlook has decreased from the credit rating agencies, showing that the debt vulnerability is increasing in the region. The response to the crisis globally has depended very much on preconditions. Interesting to note is that the stronger the containment measure was in countries, the smaller the fiscal packages have been. So, early containment has helped countries also restrain the economic risks and the need for fiscal measures. Fiscal support, as I've discussed, have dependent very much on income levels, with countries with high per capita GDP showing much higher fiscal support. Sovereign spreads have inversely been correlated with fiscal support, indicating that countries with high debt vulnerability have been able to provide smaller fiscal packages. And we've also seen that countries with high public debt have done more off-balance sheet, have done more off-budget stimulus than other countries in the world, both for advanced and middle and emerging market countries. If we look at Asia, in Asia, a number of countries had a relatively strong fiscal position before the crisis, and we see that those countries with low total government debt to GDP ratios in 2019 were able to do more in the crisis. So this is perhaps a lesson for resilience, that building up buffers and not maximizing your public debt will create benefits for stabilization of the economy. I think the following graph from the fiscal monitor is also interesting and shows the composition of spending packages of the G20, both the G20 advanced economies and the G20 emerging market countries. And it basically shows that in advanced economies, almost all the spending was income support, either of households or of corporations. There was a 6-7% spend on healthcare, additional healthcare spending. But only the emerging markets actually were able to channel some of the additional spending to public investment. So those countries have done an effort to also structurally improve their economies. On the off-balance, on the off-budget side, large part of the guarantee schemes and equity injections went to the larger corporations in advanced economies. In emerging market countries, the credit programs have been much smaller, but they have been more equally distributed between large firms and SMEs. So that is a relative success. A large part of the credit programs have been underutilized. So that is something also as a lesson for future crises, that these programs often are not that effective as they should be, perhaps. So let me turn to almost already the last slide, the fiscal challenges as countries recover. A lot of countries, of course, are not out of the woods yet. The short-term focus will still be, is the stimulus enough to kickstart the private sector? For emerging market countries, we definitely see a risk factor of disrupting capital markets that will constrain the financing of these countries and also their ability to provide stimulus to their economies. For low-income countries, those issues are even more concerning as they rely to a large extent on emergency finance and debt restructuring. On the fiscal side, low-income countries are actually, some of them are actually constraining expenditure, right? There's so little financing available that they're actually constraining expenditure. So the focus is to use all available emergency finance, not only IMF finance, but also from other development partners and international institutions, and also from the debt service suspension initiative. We see that some countries are not using all the available financing options that are there, perhaps in part because still of the IMF stigma involved and so on. In the emergency mode that many countries are still in, efficient and effective use of emergency spending is important, and we're looking especially at implementation rates of spending and how effectively governments can implement spending programs. And then lastly, on the short-term side, the timing of the pullback of fiscal stimulus will be a challenge for policymakers. Our message in the fiscal monitor is not to pull back too early, perhaps err on the side of a late pullback, because resumption of growth is really essential for a pathway to sustainability. You saw perhaps in the figures that I presented that debt levels are projected to stabilize in 2021, but that's only the case if growth picks up as projected. So over the medium term, many of the challenges, of course, were there at the start of the crisis. I think they've received new impetus. First of all, the return to a sustainable fiscal path and rebuilding of force, and with that also capacity building with respect to the use of medium and long-term fiscal frameworks. That's been on many countries' agendas and still requires, especially in low-income countries and emerging market countries, a lot of effort. Improving effectiveness and efficiency of spending, especially in countries with financing constraints, very important. Then we have, the new agenda, or it's not really a new agenda, but it's an agenda that we hope will have new impetus, focusing on income inequality, green investment, and resilient policies with a special focus on public investment. Revenue mobilization in emerging markets and low-income countries, both on the tax administration side and the policy side. The monitoring of contingent liabilities and quasi-fiscal operations will remain important. And further, for some low-income countries, perhaps more than some, structural debt reduction and rethinking of the architecture. It's a big topic by itself, but we think that some of the financing modalities for low-income countries, especially on the private sector side, are not conducive for long-term economic growth, and perhaps changes in some of the architecture is required. Finally, the special focus in Asia. targeted fiscal expenditure, because many emerging market countries and low-income emerging market countries are fiscally constrained, financially constrained, healthcare spending, reaching the poor and the informal sector, and green investment, income inequality, SDG goals. We estimate that 60% of the global SDG investment needs to be done in Asia, and that will require for many countries a structural increase in spending. Now, the good news in Asia is that revenue mobilization is really quite low. So while other countries in advanced economies have less options there, we think that in emerging and low-income Asia, there's actually a good potential for revenue mobilization. If you look at green recovery, you would think of pollution taxes and carbon taxes, but also, income tax. The traditional tax system still has room to grow, even if the strategy of the country is to remain a relatively low tax country. We think that there is room for improvement there. So I'll leave it there for now, and turn over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger, for a very nice overview of the key challenges that Asia Pacific region is facing with respect to macroeconomic responses. And you highlighted how the emerging market economies have, of course, lesser ability than the more advanced economies, but they are encouraged to use all available emergency finance and debt restructuring options. And your message that don't be in a hurry to pull out of these, stimulus programs and err on the side of, spending more than less is very well taken. And some of the issues that you have raised, and also in the last slide about the focus on SDG spending side is very well taken. And I'm sure we will come back to some of the key issues that you have raised. Let me now turn to the next speaker for this session. That is Dr. Gong. He is a senior economist in the representative office for Asia and the Pacific of the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, and he would continue, to talk about the sovereign debt restructuring, stylized facts, and macro impacts. So over to you, Gong. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I hope everybody can see my slides by now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, sure. And thank you very much for your invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to present here my work related to sovereign debt restructurings. So here, of course, the standard disclaimer applies. So the views are mine and do not represent those of the Bank for International Settlements. I think Holger's presentation gives a very good transition to what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to focus on the historical evidence about the sovereign debt restructurings. Once again, the pandemic highlighted debt vulnerabilities, especially for low-income countries. And as Holger already mentioned, the initiated this debt service suspension initiative in April, and is going to extend over next year. I think this exercise, even though it's not the focus of my work that I'm going to present now, but it sheds light on two key things I'm going to talk about. One is we need to think about who is providing debt restructurings. So here in the DSSI, we talk about the G20 countries, but also, of course, the Paris Club as the established platform for bilateral official debt restructurings. But of course, there are big critical countries like China that do not to the Paris Club. So my talk is based on my current work with Gatien Bon from University of Nanterre in France on Chinese debt restructurings overseas, and also draw lessons from my previous work with two co-authors on Paris Club restructurings. And here I'm going to talk about the evolution of official sector debt restructurings, and here with a focus on China. And then the second point I'm gonna highlight is about the restructuring terms and the macroeconomic impact of them. And finally, of course, throughout my talk, I will emphasize the interactions among different creditors, especially among official bilateral creditors, which belong to the Paris Club, China as a major new creditor, and also private sector creditors. And here to put our discussion into the Asian context, I can already shed light on these 2 points I'm going to mention, especially as regards who is providing debt restructuring throughout from several decades. So here you can see 20 countries in the region. And if we look at past sovereign debt restructurings provided by private creditors, so the red bars, we see like 6 countries that received up to 4 debt restructurings with private creditors. If we add on the Paris Club, actually we can see that many of those private sector debt restructurings were also accompanied by efforts from the Paris Club as the established platform for official bilateral debt restructuring. And if we look at some smaller countries, especially low-income countries, we can see that here, clearly there's a new creditor which we need to look at and we need to pay attention to, which is China. Because many of those countries, especially small Pacific islands and also low-income countries, receive the debt restructurings from China. And here, all the countries with a star indicates DSSI eligible countries, but not all of them have requested DSSI so far. So let me first walk you through some data and the stylized facts. So this is a quick review about the Paris Club restructurings. Bear in mind that the Paris Club has existed since late 50s. So the first case was with Argentina in 56. And we can see that throughout its 60 years of existence, the Paris Club has also evolved in very significant way, which is from the first, say in its early years, between 1956 and 1980, the Paris Club aimed primarily at facilitating debt repayments. So back then, there wasn't a specific macro goal, or the Paris Club only intervened to deal with immediate default, to prevent default. And the repayments, so all the debts still needed to be repaid. A bit similar to the DSSI concept, this NPV neutral concept. However, as we can also see from the charts at the right-hand side, we started to see a change within the Paris Club from the 80s. So from the 80s to today, the Paris Club provided debt relief with increasingly strong development aspiration, in the sense that we can see more and more NPV relief. So increasing NPV relief via maturity extensions and providing concessional rates. But also we see that the Paris Club started to provide nominal debt reduction, so what they call the stock approach from the mid-90s with the HIPC initiative, so for heavily indebted poor countries. And from mid-90s, we see the red bars start to pop up. So when the Paris Club started to provide nominal debt reduction, and of course with avian approach, which extended the treatment for HIPC countries to mid-income countries. And here with my co-author, what we did, so to build on Paris Club restructurings, we also look at China's debt relief actions in the last 2 decades. Here is very interesting because this is an area we know less about in the literature. So whether China has provided debt relief and how China approached to debt relief throughout these 2 decades. So we spent much time to improve existing data, and we went through, we did an extensive press research and also checked the IMF documentation in order to build up this database. Now it contains 140 restructuring cases between 2000 and 2019 over 64 countries. And one thing we can already see that, so bear in mind that when we talk about Paris Club restructurings, we differentiate between nominal debt treatments, stock treatments, versus a flow treatment, which is based on NPV relief, meaning that via maturity extension or changes in interest rates. Here, when we look at China's debt relief overseas, we can also see, broadly speaking, these 2 different terms, which are represented on the one hand by those red and blue bars representing nominal debt treatments, and the yellow bars representing non-nominal, meaning debt rescheduling via NPV relief. And one thing we can see that actually China started to provide debt relief from 2000. Those are the earliest dates we can find throughout 2019. And more we see this increasing in terms of occurrences, but also in terms of total debt treated with debt rescheduling. And one difference I want to highlight here is compared to the Paris Club, China, when China provided nominal debt treatment, it also intervenes in 2 different cases. In one case, it's very similar to the Paris Club, so treating future debt payment. So here we refer it as principal haircut, so changing the future cash flow payments of debt. However, also in many cases, and more in recent years, China only treated arrears, so meaning that the country canceled the accumulated missed payments from a debtor country. Those are represented by those blue bars. And how did the Paris Club, China, and also private creditor interact with each other? This is another question we ask in our current work. So one thing is, if you look at, first of all, these 2 panels, we see that in the first decades from 2000 to 2010, the Paris Club remained the primary platform for bilateral official debt restructuring, represented by those blue bars. And bear in mind that the HIPC initiative was still prevalent, so a lot of debt relief took place in HIPC countries. And here, China complemented the Paris Club's efforts by also participating in debt relief. However, from 2010 and especially 2015, we see that blue bars completely disappeared. So here, China became, to a certain extent, the major provider of debt relief for developing countries and low-income countries. Private sectors have been present in the context of debt restructuring as well. And we can see that in terms of the total debt treated, private creditors have provided a lot of treatment. However, private creditors mainly have been using debt rescheduling, so treating the debt with NPV relief without providing nominal haircuts. So this is a major difference between official creditors on the one hand and private creditors on the other. And here I also want to emphasize these charts, so the bottom left charts, which once again talk about this interaction between the Paris Club and China, even if there is no official or formal collaboration between these 2 platforms until the DSSI example. But if we observe Chinese debt restructurings that occurred around a Paris Club within a defined time horizon, for instance, within, so this panel represents a 4-year window around the Paris Club restructuring, so 2 years before or 2 years later. So we see that China is more likely to provide nominal haircuts when Paris Club provided concomitant debt relief in a given country. So this is very interesting finding, and we can see that this feature does not exist with regard to private creditor, the dynamics between private creditors and China on the other hand. Another point I can emphasize the interaction between debt relief and IMF programs. Of course, the IMF and the Paris Club have long-standing working relations. On the one hand, the Paris Club relies on the IMF's DSA to assess the size of debt restructuring. And on the other hand, the Paris Club provides financing assurances to the IMF when the fund needs to make a decision on official lending. We see that more than half of the Chinese restructurings were accompanied by the start of an IMF program, either in the same year or 1 year earlier. And in the majority cases of Chinese restructurings fall into a PRGF program from the IMF. This corresponds to the first decades of China's overseas restructurings when the Paris Club also provided debt restructuring for HIPC eligible countries. Now let's move to the second part. So here I assess the impacts of different restructurings and especially restructuring terms on macro developments in the debtor country. So for Paris Club and also for Chinese restructurings, we use the same methodology, which is based on Jorda 2005 local projections. Here, so we try to isolate or identify the causal effect of a restructuring on macro variables, conditional on IMF financing or other types of restructurings. Due to the time limit, so let me quickly walk you through the growth prospects of different restructurings. So first of all, with Paris Club restructurings, the results are very much salient in the sense that following official debt relief from the Paris Club, growth increases and debt burdens falls, as you can see here. On average, the growth impacts, so there's a positive growth impacts for the group of countries that receive the Paris Club restructurings. And this effect is especially pronounced for those countries that have received nominal haircuts. The effect is smaller for NPV relief cases. This is a sharp contrast with Chinese debt restructurings. So we run the same exercise with China's debt relief operations overseas. And we can see that on average, we don't see statistically significant impact on growth prospects in a debtor country when the country has received a Chinese debt restructuring. We do still see the differences in terms of restructuring terms. So one thing here we asked ourselves is about probably the sample size is different because China's relief is still a very recent phenomenon. We have in total 125 observations versus Paris Club debt restructurings over 60 years, and we have in total 429 cases. Before I conclude, I just want to show you one more result from the debt dynamics after China's relief. So we do see to some degree fall in debt stock and a decrease in debt service cost for arrears cancellation cases. And debt stock is still on the rise with high debt service cost for rescheduling cases. And in this case, let me emphasize that China is also more likely to seize its new credits, outstanding credit to those countries. For instance, in this case, the lower right panel, you can see that the new financing from China to a country that has received the debt rescheduling is decreasing. So China is by 5%. So China is more likely to stop new financing into those countries. Those are also more recent cases. Let me stop here, and I want to highlight that so debt vulnerabilities probably will be as previous speakers have mentioned, continue to be a long-term concern for low-income countries. While at the same time, the Paris Club has been an established platform with a lot of experience to share, China has also become an indispensable new player in the sphere. And especially it has delivered the largest debt service deferral in the DSSA situation as a single country, as per the number revealed by FT. So in the long term, as creditors, I think creditors need to think about what restructuring terms to provide to low-income countries, especially when they want to consider, they want to spur economic growth and to see concrete macroeconomic effects of their debt relief actions. I stop here, and we can continue our discussion over the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gong, for, again, very lucid overview of the debt restructuring and how it affects Asia-Pacific economies. I think your messages are very clear that the debt restructuring issues are going to haunt some developing countries for a long time, and how you have also demonstrated how China has emerged as a very important player in this debt vulnerability, debt restructuring game, complementing and supplementing Paris Club creditors. And we need to come back to some of these issues you have raised in the discussion. But let me now turn to our third speaker for this session. That is Daniel Munawar. He is Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer supporting Eurodad's work on debt justice. And Eurodad, for those who have not heard this acronym, is European Network on Debt and Development, and by now quite popular organization working on these issues. So over to you, Daniel.
Hi, good morning, everybody. From very cold morning here in Stockholm, Sweden. I would like, first of all, to thank UNESCAP for the opportunity to be in this event. Second, quickly introduce Eurodad. As Nagesh pointed out, it's the European Network for Debt and Development. We're a network of 49 organizations from 20 European countries. We do advocacy on EU policies to improve the international architecture on development. And in the case of specifically of debt, we seek to promote fundamental reforms on how debt crisis can be prevented and resolving, and we try to emphasize the importance of putting the rights of people ahead of debt. So that being said, I will quickly switch to my presentation. So the topic of my presentation is debt sustainability analysis and the 2030 agenda in the context of COVID-19. So the key messages that I want to put across with this presentation is that we are witnessing an inadequate and insufficient multilateral response to the challenges brought by COVID-19. This, coupled with an outdated methodology for debt sustainability assessment, are putting us at risk of leaving the 2030 agenda out of reach. And the reason for this is that there is a direct link from debt sustainability assessments to debt relief to SDGs. If the proposal by the G20, the common framework, follows the current DSA methodology, what we're going to witness is an excessive and counterproductive reliance on fiscal adjustment to achieve that sustainability. And that will mean that countries that require debt relief to finance SDGs will not be eligible, and countries that are eligible for debt relief will not receive enough. So we need to redefine debt sustainability not as a goal per se, but relative to the post-COVID-19 and 2030 agenda financing requirements. So COVID-19 represents an extremely challenging environment for debt sustainability assessment because it's an effort to strike the right balance in a highly uncertain environment. So a useful way to think of this, it's a balancing act. where on the one hand, on the left hand, you would have debt relief, and then on the other hand, you would have optimistic growth projections, lower financing costs, and large fiscal consolidation. The more weight you put on one of the sides of the balance, then it would shift to that side. And the problem that we're seeing is that there is too much weight being placed on optimistic growth projections, financing costs, and fiscal consolidation. And this is made worse by a methodological bias that is inserted in the DSA, which is that this is based on a model developed by the World Bank in the 1960s that basically assess the willingness of countries to sacrifice domestic objectives to meet foreign creditor claims. So how does this work in practice? So let's go first with growth projections. So this is a graph from a recent blog post by the World Bank that looks at the evolution of poverty projections using different growth vintages. And what we're seeing is that we're systematically underestimating the impact that the crisis is having on growth. So the more time goes by and the more we go through this pandemic, we see, for example, here in the case, if you look at the poverty rate measured with the 320 baseline, we see that basically from an initial estimation of 125 million people falling in poverty, we're now at 260. And the fear is that this is going to continue because basically expectations of a V-shaped recovery that have underpinned the initial response and assessments have reduced the required sense of urgency to tackle the crisis. And this optimism and growth projections also has a direct impact on DSA, because if these growth projections fail to materialize, this places a higher burden on fiscal consolidation to stabilize debt levels. The second element has to do with the financing constraints. So what we are seeing is that the crisis has substantially increased the gross financing needs of developing countries. 16 countries in the Asian Pacific region have requested IMF financial assistance for around $4.6 billion, which is a fairly small amount in the larger scheme of things. Most of all of the DSAs in the region characterize all of the debt situation in these countries as sustainable, which is concerning, and I'll go into a bit of detail later in that. So what we're seeing is that the crisis had this large impact on gross financing needs that is expected to stabilize at relatively at above pre-crisis level in the medium term. And the problem is that countries are struggling to fill their financing gaps. So what we're seeing is that basically there are two markets. So those countries that have higher credit ratings are able to continue to borrow at good rates, but those that are most vulnerable and have higher, lower credit ratings have seen their cost of financing double as a result of the crisis. And what we're seeing when we look at, given that countries are struggling to tap markets to meet those financing needs, is that they're going to the IMF. But the actual financing that the IMF providing is fairly small. And a way to show this is that the program that the IMF approved for Argentina in 2018 is basically represents more funds than all of the emergency financing that the IMF has provided to 80 countries in the aftermath of the crisis. So more needs to be done in this front, because the problem is that because growth continues to falter, financing continues to be constrained, is that there is an increasing emphasis in early fiscal consolidation. These figures that I'm presenting here come from a report prepared by Eurodat, which we can share with attendants, which assesses 80 IMF programs approved in the aftermath of the crisis. And it looks at what are the implications in terms of fiscal consolidation that are embedded in IMF emergency financing. So the first element is that because countries are struggling to access financing, they are having to implement offsetting expenditure cuts to finance their COVID response. And you can see here on the left side, there can be quite substantial. Of the 80 countries that receive IMF financing, 46 countries had to implement offsetting expenditure cuts to finance their COVID response, on average representing around 2.6% of GDP. And the problem is that these expenditure cuts are targeting sensitive areas. So here, this is information from the IMF that looks at the disaggregation of the overall expenditure in 2020. And we're seeing that, yes, countries are basically mobilizing resources to respond to COVID-19. An important part goes to health, around 0.6% of GDP, 0.4% for social protection. But we're also seeing that in order to finance that response, there has been cuts in education expenditures and development-related expenditures. And the concern is that going forward, these cuts are going to be made permanent and are probably going to also be joined by cuts on health and social protection. Why we're concerned about this? Because if you look at the evolutions of fiscal consolidation, basically the notion of debt sustainability is assessed on the basis on the need for a steep and prolonged fiscal consolidation, as the IMF highlights in its report to Development Committee for the annual meetings. So the problem is, if you look at the case here specifically of 16 countries in the Asian Pacific region that have received IMF funds, is that basically after the crisis, expenditures levels are going to return to stabilize at pre-crisis level. For the broader sample of countries, they are going to fall below pre-crisis level. If you look in the long term, up until 2030, and then you use the IMF low-income country debt sustainability framework, what you see is that the IMF is basically expecting that in the baseline scenario is that in the long run, the expenditures, primary expenditures of countries, including the DSSI and in the case of Asian Pacific countries, to fall below pre-crisis levels. So this highlights an important contrast, because on the one hand, we're hearing more to achieve the SDGs, but what we're seeing in the projections in the IMF programs is that countries in the DSSI, countries receiving IMF financing, and countries in the Asia Pacific region are going to end up spending less resources on the SDGs. And why this is important? Because it highlights the need that we need to refine that sustainability relative to the post-COVID-19 recovery requirements and 2030 agenda financing requirements. So this is a report that was published last year in the Trade and Development Report where we look at what are the implications of shifting the equation around, and instead of emphasizing meeting private creditor claims, what happens if we emphasize and prioritize developing financing needs. So in this graph, we basically see that on a business as usual scenario until 2030, debt of developing countries represented by this orange dot would stabilize at around 40 to 60% of GDP. If, on the other hand, they were to aggressively finance their SDG financing requirements to eradicate poverty, hunger, and provide universal healthcare and education, of course, the debt levels would explode. The difference between the amount of resources required to stabilize debt levels and meet their SDG requirements vary depending on region and income levels. But basically, for example, in the countries of Asia, including this analysis of 30 countries, they would need around 9% in additional resources to meet this SDG debt sustainability gap. And when we did this analysis at UNCTAD, we looked at the SDGs as a partnership where countries need to make an effort to finance their development, but they also need substantial support from the international community. And what we basically did was to look what was the composition between domestic resource mobilization, additional official development assistance, and debt relief. The problem is that when we think of updating this graph, what we're going to see, the extreme difficulty that we're going to see is that countries are going to struggle to increase domestic revenue mobilization for the next couple of years as growth fails to materialize, if that scenario ends up occurring. What we're seeing is that ODA continues to fail to increase, as highlighted by the recent OECD report of the DAC committee. And that means that debt relief, the share of debt relief that would need to be required to stabilize the levels and meet the SDGs would need to be substantially higher. And the problem is that from what we've seen in the common framework, this will not materialize. So we're extremely concerned about this. To conclude, we need a stronger response. This is a time to be conservative on our assumptions about what will happen in the future, but bold in terms of the policy responses that are required, going through a new issuance of special drawing rights, increases on ODA, and measures to tackle illicit financial flows as well as a sovereign debt workout mechanism. It's important that the IMF reviews its DSA methodology in a way that includes the requirements for the SDGs and climate change. I can say a little more about this in the in the discussion. And we need a debt relief and sustainability initiative that is consistent with what countries need in order to achieve the SDGs. So thank you very much. I'll end up here. If you have any comments or questions, the slides are available, and you can always contact me by email. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for putting on the table some very important points, and I'm sure we will come back to them. The point that you made is that we need a very stronger response, and possibly the allocation of new SDRs, increases in ODA, and establishment of effective global governance to tackle tax avoidance and illicit financing related matters is very well taken. We will come back to some of these in the discussion. Now we have completed the first part of this session, and we have heard three very lucid and very interesting presentations. Now turning to our panelists, and the first panelist on my list is Mr. Yerulan Mustafin. Are you on screen? Yerulan doesn't seem to be there. Maybe we will come back to him later. So let me turn to next one, Iris Klaus. She is a senior fellow at the University of Waikato, New Zealand, and she has previously held positions at IMF. So Iris, are you there? You have the floor. Yes. Good.
Okay, can you see the screen?
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. So my name is Iris Klaus, and I'm going to be providing a Pacific perspective. So there's two main points that I will be covering and talking about. And the first one is the large projected impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on Pacific economies. And the second point is about regional collaboration and the opportunities that it offers to rise above the COVID-19 effect. So early on in the pandemic, Pacific countries very quickly implemented a broad range of containment measures. And as a result of the implementation of these measures, the number of deaths and cases French Polynesia and Guam. But the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating. And this can be seen in this slide here, which graphs gross domestic product growth in constant US dollars. And so the black line, the solid line, is the IMF forecast before the outbreak of the pandemic in October 2019. And then the dashed line is the latest available forecast from the IMF, which was published in October of this year. And so we can see, first looking
Excuse
at
me,
the
Iris, can I ask you? Can I ask you? I think on the screen somehow I'm not seeing your entire slide. I think it's enlarged or something. At least on my screen, is it with everybody else as well?
Yes, I was going to point out the
It's
same.
noted. It's not coming full.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, now
Now,
better.
now we can see it exactly. Yeah. So you can do the slideshow now. Thanks.
Also, could all participants please mute your microphones?
Iris, go ahead. Yeah. We can't hear you now.
Seems she is also
okay.
muted.
No. It seems like someone unmuted everyone. Anyway, can you hear me again now?
Yes.
Yes, much better.
Good. All right. Okay. So the I don't know how much you heard of what I said before. Anyway, I will just repeat it. So the so in this graph here, the black dark line is solid line is the IMF forecast for gross domestic product in constant US dollars at the before the outbreak of the pandemic. So this is from the World Economic Outlook that was published in October 2019. And then the dotted or the dashed line is the IMF's forecast, the latest available forecast, which was published in October of this year. And so first looking at the graph in the top left-hand corner, we can see that the IMF is forecasting a decline in economic activity this year and then a rebound in economic activity next year. But this pattern of a decline this year and then a rebound next year is driven by the two large economies in the region, which are Australia and New Zealand. And so if we take out Australia and New Zealand, the growth rate, which is then plotted in the graph in the top right-hand corner, we can see that the IMF is forecasting a decline in GDP, and then GDP growth gradually returns to the growth rates that were previously forecast in October of last year. And so this decline in GDP growth is mainly due because of a slowdown in economic activity of the economies that have a large tourism sector and or are largely or receiving large remittances. And so these countries are Fiji, Palau, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Whereas the decline in economies that have natural resources is much smaller. And so that's plotted in the graph in the bottom left-hand corner. And so the countries that have natural resources are those that are part of the parties to the Nauru Agreement, which include the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. So those countries receive large fishing revenues. And of course, Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands also have other natural resources. So the IMF is expecting a sharper decline in economic activity in developing Asian economies. but also the forecast is for a more prolonged recovery of the economies. And they can be seen in this slide here, which plots GDP per capita. And again, it's in constant US dollars. So for the region as a whole, economic or GDP per capita in this year falls below the level that was forecast last year, and then returns to the pre-COVID-19 forecast in the coming years. But again, this pattern is driven by the two large economies in the region, which are Australia and New Zealand. And if we take out Australia and New Zealand, we can see that per capita GDP falls and it stays below the level of per capita GDP that was forecast before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, the decline in per capita GDP is due to a large decline in per capita GDP of the countries that have large tourism industries and or are reliant on remittances. And again, the decline for the countries with the natural resources is smaller. So the decline in economic activity reduces government revenue. At the same time, public expenditure has increased because of increased health spending and because of fiscal measures that have been implemented to support economies. And so the result is a large increase in fiscal deficits, which gives rise to a net borrowing requirement and an increase in government indebtedness. So the government debt as a percent of GDP is projected to increase sharply for the Pacific region. So in 2019, it was around 40%, and it's projected to increase to over 70%. So this sharp increase in the debt to GDP ratio is because of a rise in debt in Australia and New Zealand, because of less revenue but more spending, and it's also due to an increase in the debt to GDP ratio in the tourism countries, Fiji, Samoa, and Vanuatu, because of more spending and less revenue, and because the level of output has declined. So where does all this leave us? So material well-being has fallen sharply in developing Pacific countries because of lower output and income. In Australia and New Zealand, the level of government debt has started to increase quite sharply. And probably because of this funding that's provided by Australia and New Zealand to the region is going to be reduced. So for developing Pacific countries to return to pre-COVID-19 and higher living standards, and to make sure that they have sufficient funding to finance essential government goods and services and repay debt, productive capacity and incomes in developing Pacific countries have to increase. And to achieve this, more regional collaboration is needed. Pacific countries, including Australia, are small in terms of populations and in terms of GDP, and they are very remote from markets. And so as a result of this, costs are high because of high transport costs and reduced economies of scale and scope. But the region has natural resources. So the UN SCAP Pacific members control 28%, or excluding Australia and New Zealand, 19% of the world's exclusive economic zone. So the exclusive economic zone is the sea zone and includes the seabed and the subsoil, which countries have a right to explore and use the marine resources of. And 50% of the Pacific's EEZ, excluding Australia and New Zealand, are guarded by security and defense arrangements with France, New Zealand, and the United States. And some countries receive quite significant revenues from these arrangements. Also, a number of the countries in the Pacific have open ship registry, and actually the world's second largest ship registry is located in the Pacific. Pacific countries also have forest. So the forest area, the combined forest area in the Pacific is almost a third of the size of the Amazon forest, or 7% if we include Australia and New Zealand. Regional collaboration in the Pacific region is particularly important because it helps to overcome the challenges of size and distance, and also to make best use of the natural endowments that the region has. Collaborative partnerships are formed for three main reasons: to reduce costs, to enhance competitive advantage, and to transfer knowledge and experience and technology. And the economic benefits have been demonstrated in the region by the parties to the Nauru Agreement, Vessel Day Scheme, and the seasonal workers programs. There's many more opportunities for regional collaboration that exist in the region, and already there are several arrangements in place to build on. And some of these are for example, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat and the PESA Plus trade agreement. But a political shift will be needed away from focusing on individual countries, but focus is needed on maximizing the well-being of the region as a whole. Also, common vision and alignment of policies will be required. Stronger regional partnerships will lead to better outcomes because of lower costs, greater market and bargaining power, and also because proposals will more scrutinized when decisions must be made unanimously. And I will conclude here. And just in the next slide, I've listed some of the initiatives that I think are worthwhile to consider further. However, what initiatives are desirable or feasible to take forward, that's a decision that needs to be made by Pacific leaders. Also, I think it would be useful to have some evaluation and try to quantify the economic benefits of the initiatives. And then, of course, there's the question of sequencing. So I don't think all of those initiatives could be implemented in the short run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris, for sharing the perspective of the Pacific island nations, and in particular showing how affected by this pandemic and how regional collaboration and cooperation could help them in getting over the challenges they are facing. So with that, let me turn to Matthew. Matthew, are you there, Matthew?
Yes, I'm. Can you see
Yes.
me now? Yeah,
All
let
right.
me
Yes.
share
Let me
my
just say that Matthew is a group head and lead economist at the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO, which is responsible for leading a group of economists to undertake surveillance on member economies in ASEAN Plus 3. It's a very important new initiative, or relatively recent initiative, and Matthew worked in the Hong Kong Monetary Authority before. So you have the floor, Matthew.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint first. I can share from my PC. I think this is the one. Can you see it now? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I will put it on the full screen. Yeah. Can you see it now? Or not? Maybe.
Yeah.
I think
We can see.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Looks fine.
I don't know. Let me yeah, I think is it this okay? The smaller one. Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
It's fine.
I think that's better for me. Let me turn my camera off first so you can concentrate on the on the PowerPoint. Let me first say thank you for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to be a discussion for this important event. Let me say something before my presentation. First, I got the email. My topic for the discussion is something on the GVC, but today I look at the program. It's something for I can't remember. It's something slightly changed. We're thinking the development in Southeast Asia in the context of COVID and sluggish reform in global demand. So my PowerPoint may be not exactly for the the question for today, the topic, the question, but anyway, because earlier email I received from the organizer, the topic, the question is something like this: the two questions, the COVID immediately and a medium impact on the export-led GVC focused development strategy for the ASEAN plus 3, and how should the ASEAN country respond to the anticipated changes? Okay, let me explain on so I can relate back something to the fiscal policy and or the development. So yeah, actually, Emerald did a research on the GVC for the region in our flagship propagation, the ARIO, the ASEAN Pacific Economic Outlook this year in May. So inside the flagship propagation, we have a chapter on this study. So my material, based on the material from the flagship propagation. So let me recap what was the situation for the pre-COVID for the region, particularly on the GVC. Actually, we have seen the emerging market in the region actually moving up the ladder and manufacturing not only the the low cost products or labor intensive products, but the manufacturing for export strategy still remains for the developing economies of the ASEAN region, namely we call CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Actually, Vietnam now we are more likely to classify it as emerging market in the region rather than a developing country, because its manufacturing industry is moving up quickly, benefit a bit from the relocation of the manufacturing base from the major economy, China, into the ASEAN region. So you can see in terms of the labor cost and also the components, the export growth strategy still remain relevant for, say, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And then the study actually suggests something I think is still relevant, even in the pre-COVID, in the post-COVID era, is we develop the regional supply chain or network that is even larger, because we think because of the protectionism for the region, we can develop the supply chain for ourselves, and then moving up the GVC based on technology and skills upgrade and structural change. This morning I heard something from the Philippines, Beltran, the Undersecretary of the Philippines Department of Finance. They want to develop their ICT infrastructure, but that is expensive. So definitely, the region need to invest into the technology, the information technology in the post-pandemic period. But that if this is a very costly investment. I think part of it may come from the government. So it will have the fiscal implication anyway, right? So that is something for the region. And then also the region can, continue is the fourth industrial revolution, like automation, robotic, those things. Those also need investment. That is, um, not without cost. And then we can go to the new growth um, paradigm, that is factory Asia, shopper Asia. That means because of our middle class population is increasing, so instead only manufacturing goods for other regions, actually we can manufacturing goods for our own consumption. That is will be something like more reliable for in terms of the consumption of the manufacturing products here. But then I'm thinking, what's the situation? In the during the pandemic, uh, some of us already mentioned a lot, like the presentation before me. We can see the supply chain disruption due to lockdowns. That is definitely at the beginning. There was China because it is close Wuhan, and then some of the provinces in say in February, March, and April. But because of the containment was very successful, then China can relax the lockdowns gradually. So now you can see China supply chain is already back to um, something we call normal. Of course, because of the uh, demand reduced and also the supplies reduced, and then we have reduction of income. This is the problem for a lot of economies. Even in the advanced economy, luckily, the governments, can issue bonds and then give subsidies to the those unemployed. In the region, I think some our economies like Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, the government issue a lot of bonds, debt, then give some subsidies to support the small companies so that they can still employ their staff, and the staff still have income. But the reduction of income is a big problem right right now for not only A+3 region, it's also for many other regions. Then some in traditional industry, we see they may not survive after the pandemic. But on the other hand, there will be some new industry coming up, benefit from the pandemic. Yeah. And the sentiments of protectionism may be further strengthened because of the lockdown and the reduction of income in other regions. And some of our economies in the A+3 region may not fit the new normal if they don't reform. That is my next slide. And how we maintain the resilience for the region in the post COVID-19. I think I can think of three areas. The first one is the most important and very urgent is strengthening our healthcare and the social security capacity. I heard some speaker mention this point before, so I don't need to elaborate. And then we adopt technology. We escalated digitalization, upgrade our ICT infrastructure, and then train up or move up our labor to fit the new industry. And then we configuring the GVCs, like diversify the sources and market, reshore or nearshore production of strategic goods. But my last slide is to do this is not without any challenges. Actually, there's a lot of challenges or strong challenges facing us. That first is the infrastructure and the human capital gap. That is, government need to spend a lot of money from the fiscal spending. Maybe also can have a PPP, the public-private partnership, to fill up the gaps, and then some of the strategic manufacturing, maybe the advanced economy like to move back into the economy. I can think of at least the medical equipment and stuff. At the beginning of the pandemic, you can see there's a lack of like facial masks, the surgical masks, and if some of the economy, advanced economy, already said it publicly, they will move back those industry just for the national security. And then we need a well-managed strategy of the current emergency stimulus measure, how to exit, the exit strategy, how to exit in the post pandemic period to avoid the cliff effect to the growth and financial stability. Of course, when we say factory Asia, shopper Asia, then the regional demand is a bit uncertain. Say, I give an example, like China. China now say something like the dual circulation. So it may emphasize a bit more on the domestic demand. That may be something, I don't know. On one hand, it may have more demand for the region exports, or it will consume more its domestic output than import less from the region. So, okay, let me stop here. There's a lot of discussion. I may not have a lot of good answers. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing the ASEAN perspective, and in particular, how they can surmount the key challenges that they are facing by strengthening healthcare, social security, and adopting technology, reconfiguring GVCs to near-term, near-shoring, onshoring kind of activities. Again, very important points, and we come back to them in the discussion. Let me turn to the next panelist, that is Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, currently Vice Chancellor in Bangalore of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar School of Economics. It's a new university set up in India. But Professor Bhanumurthy has been a long-standing professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. So he will focus on South Asia's perspective. Bhanu, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. Let me also thank Mr. Malik and Shweta for inviting me to this expert group meeting on COVID-19 and the resilience of the economies. I'm basically trying to focus more on India. This is what my expertise is, and because we had a very wonderful talks by three major presentations, especially by Mr. Holger on the fiscal response and the fiscal space. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the country-specific issues when it comes to fiscal policy or fiscal space of India. And because this is going to get into the ESCAP survey, I have a little bit to say about the GDP forecast as well, where I might have slightly different take on India's GDP numbers than what the ESCAP survey might be saying. Can you see? Hello? Can you see my slide?
See some. Somebody. Is this your presentation, Bhanu? There is a Chinese script.
No. No. I think in between something has come up. I don't know.
Yeah. So I wasn't aware of your Chinese language capacity.
No. I think this is my screen. I can see my screen.
Let me clarify. That was not a Chinese language. It's something like Korean, the Korean writing. Yeah.
Can you see now my screen?
Takes a moment. It hasn't.
Not yet.
Hello.
Not yet.
Well, sorry about the interruption. Actually, it was me,
Hello.
Korean economist, Hyun Lee, who was preparing next presentation. I'm sorry about what happened.
All right. Okay. So Banu, we can't see your slides. Anyway, maybe you can talk without the benefit of the slides.
Actually, Nagesh, I think we can go back to our very first speaker now. I think Bhanu is still kind of figuring this out. I'm not sure if he's on the list now. I think he just exited. So we could go back to Yerulan Mustafa.
Is he there, Yerulan?
Hello.
Yes, Bhanu. Yes.
Yeah, there was some problem. I don't know what happened in between.
Now,
can I continue?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So, so I just take on from where Dr. Holger has talked about the fiscal space as well as fiscal response. So I'm going to say a little brief about from where India has come from, especially when they entered the pandemic. So I just wanted to say that Indian economy was in a slowdown phase even before the pandemic has hit us. Where the last year GDP growth was 4.2%, and that was the lowest growth that was recorded in the last one decade. And in the current year, we have seen the contraction of GDP by almost a quarter of minus 24% contraction in the first quarter. 2 days ago, the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, said that right now India is actually in the technical recession with a negative growth expected even in the second quarter. But that itself is a good news for us. Many analysts are actually talking about a prolonged deep recession in India. That means more than 2 quarters of negative GDP growth predicted for the whole year. Situation was very weak. Those who don't know much about India, we have a strong federal setup where we have a central government as well as the states. Many of the states are much bigger than some of the countries in the region. So in that sense, the role of states actually becomes much more important, especially when we talk about the pandemic. The reason why I'm saying this is that I think in the economic survey, the discussion on the state's role seems to be not really highlighted, and that is one of the reasons why I'm bringing this here. When it comes to the fiscal situation of the central government, we have already seen where the central government, even before the pandemic, they have invoked the escape clause of running 0.5% more fiscal deficit against what the fiscal consolidation roadmap has suggested. And against 3.8% fiscal deficit for the last year, the revised estimates show that the India's fiscal deficit was actually 4.6%. More importantly, as the previous speakers pointed out, what is more worrying for us is the rising public debt to GDP ratio, where the aim was to achieve 60% by 23-24. We have already seen that the public debt to GDP ratio touching 80% by the time the India got into the pandemic. Rating agencies have already downgraded. We have seen even most of the major rating agencies actually downgraded. And right now, when it comes to dealing with the pandemic, I think there are a lot of discussion about the kind of fiscal consolidation roadmap that we need to adopt. In my view, I think what right now the India is adopting is actually not a expansionary kind of a framework. I used to say it's more of a flat one. There's also a lot of confusion about what exactly the fiscal consolidation. Somehow there is an understanding that fiscal consolidation nothing but expenditure compression, but I think it is actually expenditure switching mechanism. Unlike in the past, this time when we talk about the fiscal stimulus or fiscal support, we are seeing a sustained decline in the domestic savings. All of you know that India and China were the largest saving countries in the region, but unfortunately in the recent period, we have seen the savings are actually declining much faster than what we thought. And on the macro policies, we have seen flexible inflation targeting, but on the other hand, what we have is on the fiscal side is a tight fiscal target. I think these are the policy inconsistencies that we had. These are the conditions that we had when we actually entered the pandemic in the month of March. There's a lot of discussion. I think even in the survey, there is some discussion about the shape of recovery. There is something like V, U, W, but I think the most plausible, in my view, is something like a smoking pipe kind of a shape, where we do see a sharp reduction. By the way, I think in the case of India, more than the pandemic, it is the stringent lockdowns for 2 months that is going to that seems to have impacted more than the pandemic itself. So we are expecting that the recoveries might take longer time than what even the survey talks about. I think the V-shaped or U-shaped. But in terms of the policy side, we have seen a very active monetary policies, where we have seen a sharp reduction in the repo rate and the policy interest rates. We have seen a huge liquidity support to the market. Even the central bank came out with loan moratorium. So there are a lot of support that we have seen, from the monetary policy side. But I think what was more important in the pandemic situation was more of an active fiscal policy, but with a more supportive monetary policy. I think what we got was an opposite of that. We had a very active monetary policy, but a very with a hesitant, a fiscal policy stance until June, July. But later, what we have seen was we have seen a large fiscal support in terms of a huge package called Self-Reliant India. Under that, I think the government of India has actually provided something like 15% of GDP as the fiscal support. Again, in the survey, somewhere it says about only 7%. There is, in fact, we need to have a little bit of conceptual clarity about what exactly the fiscal support that the government of India has provided. More space has been provided for the states. Unlike in the past, I think this time states have been provided larger fiscal support, although there were some issues in terms of sharing of taxes, especially the indirect taxes. But I think the government came out with many measures to support the state governments. So there are some conceptual, as I said, what is the cost of fiscal support measures? I think this is where we keep differing among the analysts. And can the fiscal and monetary support help revive the economy? Then there are a lot of issues about how to finance the deficits. And there's so much discussion about monetizing the fiscal deficits. I think, I personally believe, I think this is not the time to really go back to the direct monetization. And there is also a discussion about what would be the inflation, what would be the impact of fiscal support on the inflation. And during the global financial crisis and the post-global financial crisis, many studies have showed the fiscal support through the tax cuts was very useful. But I think this time round, there's not much of discussion on whether the fiscal support can be provided through the taxes. And at least in this region, I think the South Asia region, this discussion on fiscal deficit versus governance deficit is something again becomes crucial. I think in 2017 or 18, ESCAP survey focused entirely on the governance deficit. I think it is going to be much more relevant now when we talk about providing more fiscal space to the countries in the region. Impact on the growth. In my assessment, since I've been in this profession of providing forecasts for the Indian economy, with the kind of fiscal support, as I said, in my own estimations, the fiscal support would be something to the tune of 15% of the GDP, maybe one of the highest in the region. To expect still a large negative GDP growth in the current year seems to be, it's difficult for me to accept that we are going to see a very large negative GDP growth. And my own model says that we would be achieving something, a positive nominal GDP growth in the current year. Now, the real GDP growth, as some of the speakers just pointed out, Mr. Matthew pointed out, the pandemics actually disturbed the supply chains in a big way. So the real GDP growth in India will actually depend on how we are going to manage the supply side issues as well as inflation. Those who are monitoring Indian inflation, they would know that India's inflation has been more than the central bank's target rate of 6% for almost 5 to 6 months. Even the latest reading says that it has actually increased to 7.6%. So in a way, there is a fear that are we staring at what we have seen in the post-global financial crisis, where the large fiscal stimulus has actually led to a double-digit inflation for a longer period, like more than 2 years. So I think that's the fear that at least personally I have. At the moment, I think there are large supply constraints. And again, as Mr. Matthew pointed out, a large part of the small firms actually had to close. So we don't even know that when they are going to revive. And again, we have seen a huge reverse migration in the country. We are not even sure how they are going to, when they are going to come back to the economic activity. So all these things have actually led to huge supply disruptions. Until unless we don't address supply side issues, any extent of fiscal support, in my view, it might end up more into inflation rather than generating a real GDP growth. So that is my view. And the reason why I differed from the existing forecast is that I think the forecasts need to be conditional upon the policy support. And as I said, the fiscal support is almost 15% of GDP, both central and state together if you take it up. And in terms of the monetary support, there is almost 8% of GDP is the support that has been provided by the central bank. So these together, one should expect a reasonably better GDP growth than most of the analysts are pointing out. One last point about, I think this slide I have put up when I was discussing 2017 or 18 economic survey. I think in India, but I think it's not limited to India. It's more to the South Asian region. I think what is more important is focusing more on improving public expenditure efficiency. This is something that I have done for the Indian states. By the way, those who are not from India, I think some of the states are, as I said in the beginning, much bigger than many countries in the region. So if you look at this graph, the efficiency levels or the inefficiency levels are, it's huge. So until unless we don't address this public expenditure inefficiency part, in my view, any fiscal support that we prescribe may not really result in positive outcomes. So let me stop here. One last point I just wanted to talk, and I'll stop here. One of the lessons that we learned during the global financial crisis was, the linkage between the fiscal policy and the financial markets, and which actually led to the second round crisis region. I think this region, particularly Asia Pacific region, I think some lessons need to be learned in terms of the relationship between the fiscal policy and the financial markets. Otherwise, I think we may be addressing the short-term issues, but I think in the medium term to long term, we might be seeing a relapse of the economic crisis as experienced in European Union. Let me stop here and thank you so much.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me? You can hear me?
You're breaking up, Nagesh.
Sorry? Somebody has to unmute myself, so because I can't unmute myself.
Nagesh, your voice is breaking.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah, now it's better, I think.
Okay, good. Thank you, Panu, for sharing the challenges that Indian economy has been facing in this crisis. And as you rightly said, it entered the pandemic with a lot of weaknesses, and they have been aggravated as we went into it. Now, let me move to, because we run out of time, very little time is left, and still two more panelists. So I want to turn to Professor Hyun Hoon Lee of Gangwon National University, Republic of Korea. And quickly, I would like him to talk about whether this crisis is going to aggravate this and accelerate the process of deglobalization that was talked about. And I believe that you have written a book on this. So over to you, Professor Lee.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if all of you can see my PPT slides now.
Yeah.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
We can.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you can, right?
If you could kindly be very brief, because we have still one more.
Sure, I'll try to be very brief. I do have a number of actual pages in my presentation, but I just try to skip many of them. Thanks very much for your kind invitation. Actually, I'm so happy to be back to this kind of meeting organized by ESCAP, because I used to work for UN ESCAP in 2005 as a senior environmental affairs officer in the ESDD. Anyway, very good to see you all. And let me just begin with current status of COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, globally, the COVID-19 pandemic is still very much, expanding. So there is no sign that it is slowing down at all. This is particularly true in the US and in Europe. As a matter of fact, there is a special team in the WHO, and the team leader, Mr. Mike Ryan, recently said that about 10% of the global population may have contracted COVID-19, meaning that the official number is just 1/10 of what is really going on. So we are very serious COVID-19 pandemic. Even if we are going to see some sort of, vaccine under development. Perhaps it will take another 1 year for the majority of population can get the benefit of vaccine. So meaning that perhaps at least until the first half of next year, we are gonna have to live with COVID-19 pandemic. As Mr. Chair just introduced very kindly, I recently actually wrote two books actually. One is written in Korean and another is in English. The first one is actually about, actually I was focusing more on the Korean case, but the second one is rather focusing on the Asian region. Actually, this is co-authored with Dr. Dong-hyun Park of Asian Development Bank. So I'm gonna actually use some of the material that I wrote in these two books, by the way. So there has been a talk of another Great Depression. So many people believe that, well, COVID-19 pandemic is now fading and perhaps we are not going to have such kind of Great Depression. So even today, many of the actually forecasts made by IMF and others are rather very much optimistic as far as I'm concerned, as for the next year. To me, we have to be very alert on what is really going to happen, because now we are now entering the winter season in the northern hemisphere, but already most of the European countries and the US are now experiencing very rapidly increasing number of confirmed cases, as you know. So some panelists already emphasized the importance of the global value chain being halted or being reshuffled. So I'm not going to talk much about this. But what I like to emphasize is that deglobalization, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, is now gaining momentum. In fact, deglobalization is not something that is beginning to happen this year because of just the coronavirus pandemic. It had started well before the pandemic. As you can see now in the following three figures, for example, global exports of goods and services as the percentage of GDP has been slowing down since the global economic crisis of 2009. And also foreign direct investment as the percentage of GDP has been decreasing quite drastically, as you see now. And also the movements of people, as you see now, in recent years have been decreasing. So taking all this together, we can say that globalization has come to an end in a sense. Actually, it is sort of now sort of approaching the finish line. But I'm going to argue that we are going to have another quite new wave of globalization in line with the fourth industrial revolution. So there are some root causes of deglobalization, but because of the time constraint, I'd rather not go over one each. But I like to emphasize that during the rapid expansion of globalization in most of the countries, there has been very increasing high polarization of income and wealth within countries, while there has been sort of depolarization of income and wealth between developed country group and emerging country group. For example, you just think of the US versus China. So there has been sort of narrowing gap between the US and China in terms of GDP and GDP per capita, and all this have made advanced countries to turn to rather trade protectionism, and there are some other points that I like to emphasize, like the fourth industrial revolution itself has been also causing deglobalization and also secular stagnation due to the population aging of most of the advanced countries is another factor. But no time for each one of these to discuss in detail. So I like to actually briefly touch upon the long-term consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. Number one is, I think, the very high possibility of Cold War between America and China. You have heard of Thucydides trap, which is actually the term that was actually first coined by Greek historian when he was analyzing the origins of the Peloponnesian war between the incumbent hegemon Sparta at the time and the rising challenger Athens. Now, according to Professor Graham Allison, in his recent book entitled Destined for War, for the past 500 years, there were 16 instances when the incumbent superpower came into a sharp conflict with an aspiring superpower. And 12 out of 16 cases actually ended up with wars between the two superpowers. One exception was the US versus the former Soviet Union. When there was a kind of hegemonic power struggle between the US and the Soviet Union, they didn't actually enter any real war by themselves, but that was a kind of a Cold War, meaning that there were many proxy wars. Small neighboring countries were victims of the Cold War between the US and the US and the Soviet Union. Now we are now having a similar kind of Cold War between the US and China. So just like what we just witnessed in the case of the US and Soviet Union, I feel that the US and China will not have the actual hot war between themselves, but there will be a kind of Cold War, between these two superpowers, and many of the Asian countries will have to will be perhaps forced to choose one side over the other, and there's a kind of high possibility that there will be another wave of proxy wars, particularly in the region of Asia and the Pacific. That's something that I feel really worried about. But luckily enough, now because of the COVID-19 pandemic, now we are now witnessing the acceleration of the fourth industrial revolution. Now we are using online network to have this kind of presentations and discussions, and all these technologies are belonging to the fourth industrial revolution technologies. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, now we are now very, we are in a position to utilize many of the new technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud service, and digital network, and e-commerce, and fintech, and robots, and 3D printing, and so on and so forth. So, all these are, actually the new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So what I would like to say is that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, now the fourth industrial revolution gathers kind of great momentum. So we see the rapid expansion of the new industrial revolution in the coming years. So then what does that really imply? That implies that we are going to have a new wave of globalization, which will be perhaps evolving in tandem with the fourth industrial revolution. That's actually kind of the experience that we had in the past. For example, now we have had the first, the second, and the third industrial revolutions. Now we are now having the fourth industrial revolutions, and actually each of industrial revolution was followed by globalization. The fourth industrial revolution followed by the first globalization before World War I, and then second industrial revolution was followed by the second globalization between the two world wars, and then the third globalization has been evolving in tandem with the third industrial revolution. What this all means that we are going to see sort of the end of the globalization, which is in fact the third globalization. Now we are going to have a new wave of globalization, which will be evolving in tandem with the fourth industrial revolution. So what are the choices for Asia and the Pacific then? To me, outward-looking growth is a necessity, not a choice. As a matter of fact, the story of Asia's economic miracle is a story of outward-looking, export-oriented growth strategy. Globalization, the third globalization, which actually started after World War II, and actually there was a very rapid globalization process since 1990s. And many of the Asian countries have been able to catch up with the advanced countries by aggressively, rigorously taking part in the outward-looking, export-oriented industrialization growth strategy. But as I said, now actually we are now witnessing sort of the end of the third globalization. Then the point is that we shouldn't turn to the inside of our economies, but we have to continue our outward-looking growth strategy with new wave of globalization, which is what I call the fourth globalization. Then what is how does it look like, the fourth wave of globalization? This once again will be evolving in tandem with the fourth industrial revolution. So we have many online on-tech technologies such as AI and robots and things like that. We are going to utilize all those new technologies to have a new shape of globalization. There are three, I think, characteristics that I'd like to emphasize. Number one, in the third wave of globalization, there was kind of unidirectional supply of goods and services from the firms to the consumers. But with the new wave of globalization, we have a sort of simultaneous exchanges of ideas and also goods and services between business firms and consumers. So number one, once again, is rather two-way flows of goods and services, information and ideas and things like that. Number two is that previously, globalization was rather Americanization, but now we'll have a new wave of globalization, which is quite different from Americanization. Perhaps we'll use our own languages rather than just speaking English, thanks to the new industrial revolution technologies. I mean, there is a kind of a very rapid development of simultaneous translation of different languages. So as an epilogue, I like to say that we have had like Pax Britannica and then Pax Americana, but now previously during the first and second industrial revolution and the first and second globalization periods, most of the Asian countries, or most of the countries in the region of Asia and the Pacific, were not able to participate in the industrial revolutions and globalization, processes. But we were able to ride the third globalization and also third industrial revolution. Now, depending upon how we can come up, we could ride a new wave of globalization in tandem with the fourth industrial revolution. Perhaps we'll be able to live in a new world with the Pax Asiana. So there has been some sort of power shift of the global global landscape. So that's what I like to say at the end of my presentation. Back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee. This was most interesting argument and presentation. The fourth industrial revolution leading to fourth wave of globalization. Very interesting. We look forward to reading your book to get the fuller argument. But the hope that you have expressed that Asia would play a greater role in shaping global economic, trade, and financial governance, I think is very important. And as the heft or the weight of the Asian economies rises in the world economy, it is inevitable that we would be moving in that direction. Now, having listened to the four panelists, I can turn to Mr. Yerulan Mustafin, who is the Deputy Director of Financial Stability and Research Department in the National Bank of Kazakhstan. And he would talk about North and Central Asia perspective, especially the synergies that these countries are exploiting between the monetary and fiscal side or to address the crisis. So you have the floor, Yerulan. Are you there? If not, then let us try to see some of the questions, and they can be possibly taken up. Sweta, you have any advice? What do we do? Shall we wait for Mr. Yerulan?
Actually, Nagesh, I mean, like I see him here, and I don't know if he's muted right now, or I don't know if I've tried to actually reach out to him, but I haven't heard from him. So why don't you go ahead with the questions that were asked in the chat, or somebody else who wants to ask any other question in the meantime? Yeah, sure.
All right. So let me turn to some of the questions, and then we can see who can answer some of these. There is a question about Dr. Edo Andreas. ILO estimated that within ASEAN, only 14% of the labor force is engaged in skilled work, thus 86% medium and low skilled. This is a major worry in my opinion. This is an opinion. So let me see what are the other questions. Then Takwa Jema. What is the relationship between COVID-19 and NTMs and their effect? Presumably, she's referring to non-tariff measures. Then again, Dr. Edo Andreas, why is the output efficiency in Kerala and Tamil Nadu so low? Obviously, this is addressed to Professor Bhanumurthy. Then Imed Drine, the crisis is not yet over, and certainly we don't have a clear idea on how the world after COVID-19 will look like. So don't you think that it is still too early to suggest any radical shift in terms of development paradigm? Good question. So there are these some interesting questions. I want to turn to our speakers and panelists who want to take. I see one clearly related to Bhanu Murthy. So Bhanu, you want to come in?
Yeah, I saw that message and I sent a direct reply to the person.
Yes.
Basically, I said that the Kerala and Tamil Nadu, in fact, is based on one of the studies that I have done. The relation between the governance and the public expenditure efficiency. So we did find that there is a positive correlation between these two concepts. So better the govern the states, I think the public expenditure efficiency is better. So I did respond to the person directly.
All right. So anyone else who wants to respond to any of these questions? Is Mr. Yarulan back?
No, he's not there. Perhaps actually, Nagesh, why don't you ask if somebody else has any questions to ask in the audience now?
Yes.
Can I ask answer the question about the first one? The first
Yeah.
question that
Please go
about
ahead.
the only 13% of our labors are up to the challenge. I don't have any other calculation, but in my sense, my understand, maybe for A+3, the percentage may be higher for some economies, but for the developing economies of A+3 region, like the Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, maybe. But for some emerging markets like Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Indonesia, maybe Philippines, I think the percentage may be higher. So it's difficult to answer whether that is, but I think because of this pandemic, I have heard many policymakers of this region. They said they will fill up the gap on the human capital. I guess that is a good thing that the regional governments would spend more in the human capital investment. If this is the case after the pandemic era, then I guess that will be good for the regional economy to move up. Yeah, that's I guess this is my not a very good answer, but anyway, we can discuss. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other speaker, panelists wants to respond to anything? Any point raised on the chat box?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Sure. Go ahead, please.
What should be the role of the banks for post-pandemic era?
What could be the role of the
banks?
Okay.
Yes.
Is this directed to any particular speaker or?
Not in particular speaker, but this topic which are going on just now.
All right. Okay. Any other comment, question, or a view? Because we need to close this session. We are already 25 minutes, 15 minutes over our time. So,
Can I have a last question?
Sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Is there, in terms of adopting a development framework, do we need to adopt a homogeneous framework for all countries? And what would these indicators look like? But I would assume, looking at the presentations, that it should be, there's a level of nuancing that we need to include for countries in the north versus countries that are in the developing world. So I guess my question is how these indicators would differ from different developmental contexts. Thank you.
And are you referring to any particular speaker or is general?
Just a question in general to the panel. Thank you.
Well, quick answer is, of course, initial conditions, define the responses, and there can't be one single homogeneous response for every country. No, size fits all kind of. No one size fits all kind of a response. Anyhow, if there are no other comments or questions anybody wants to make, whether from the speaker side or from the audience side, I want to take this opportunity to thank.
Actually, Nagesh, there is a hand up, actually. Just now I saw.
Okay, let me see who it is.
I I think it was by Muhammad Zahir.
Yes. Mohammed, do you want to take the floor? Yes, Mohammed Zahir. All right. Doesn't seem
I
to
guess
be.
fine.
Yes, it's okay. So I think I want to really thank the three speakers and four panelists. Unfortunately, we lost the fifth one, maybe because of technical problems. So three speakers and four panelists for bringing to us a very, very rich discussion. And I'm sure that this will be a great input for the 2021 survey. And the team is really very grateful to all your very erudite and very analytical presentations. We will be in touch with everyone and will engage all the speakers and panelists and other commentators in the preparation of the survey, which is an annual exercise. With those words, I want to hand over to Sweta, the coordinator of this conference. Sweta, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nagesh, and thank you to all the presenters for wonderful presentations. So just a housekeeping thing. As you can see in the chat, many people are asking for presentations. The ones we had received and had the permission, we've already put them up. Could the others kindly share their presentations with us, send them to us, and we'll put them up on our website, the one that's been shared with all the registered participants. So that's one thing. And I just wanted to actually remind everybody who's here that we are going to log in tomorrow again from the same platform for a session, which is our session 4 on economic resilience to shocks. So we have a very good panel put together actually for that one. They'll talk about what is the impact of different kinds of shocks. Is there a trade-off between growth and resilience? Immediate versus dynamic effects of shocks, and so and so forth. So please join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bangkok time. Until then, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow. And
Thank
thank
you.
you everybody. Actually, Holger, Daniel,
Thank
Gong.
you, Sweta. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you so
and
much.
take care.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Hi, Henwan, are you still there?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Actually, it was a wonderful presentation. I know you didn't get enough time. You could have taken some more time to go over your
Yes.
book.
Thanks a lot. Tomorrow I'll be present anytime. I'll be in time. Yes.
Yeah. So, but
Okay.
please do send us your slides because somebody was asked now. So that we
Okay.
can put them.
I have asked a question, but I could not get the reply regarding role of banks. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So nice of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.